let's congratulate Mr. Putin with his new status. The International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant for him and also for Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian Children's Affairs Commissioner. Is that what she is? She's in her late 30s. And this thing will really elevate her, actually, within the unlovely dynamics of the Putin regime. Yes, Commissioner, Ombudswoman, some people have said. So let's do it like this. Let me say a couple of things about the ICC and international institutions generally, and then we'll just go through a few quick-fire questions about the practical consequences of Mr. Putin's arrest warrant. Now, the International Criminal Court had sort of a painful birthing period. A lot of Americans were part of it coming into the world, but in the end it came into the world in the face of fierce resistance from the United States. There's plenty of conflict in the late Clinton administration about this. But in the end, the feeling that no American soldier should end up in that court wasn't satisfied by the complementarity principle, which means that if somebody's being tried at home, then they won't be picked up by the court. It wasn't covered by the agreement with many states that they would just send somebody back to the United States and wouldn't expose them to the criminal court. It wasn't enough also that that the United States could block a UN Security Council referral to the court, and at what point the Department of Defense threatened European countries that the US would remove its troops from Europe if Europe continued to insist on universal jurisdiction for the court. So basically, a major power like the United States signs on to something like this if it feels that this will constrain its enemies more than it constrains it. And so this creates an extraordinary sort of predicament for international institutions, and that is that they are only independent insofar as they are weak, and they can only transcend their weakness insofar as they lose their independence. It's true of the United Nations too, right? The United Nations is not accidentally weak. Right? It's weak because the only way it could get stronger is if it further lost independence, right? And the only way it could gain further independence is if it gave up even the limited powers that it has. So this is an insoluble principle of international institutions, and we have to see it as a bug and a feature at the same time, and not just a bug. So, having laid a few foundations, let's take some blitz questions. I suppose I'd first of all say, though, that this is a theme we're going to keep coming back to, Putin and children. Because there is this extraordinary story of the stolen Ukrainian children that this is about. But there is also this extraordinary obsession with Russian children that the Putin regime has, trying to indoctrinate in a way that we haven't really seen for decades, really young kids into some kind of vague Russian world Putinite, quasi-totalitarian, mystical nonsense. So what's the significance of this for Lvova-Belova, for the woman? The fact that there's a warrant for her too. And I think there is a kind of double significance there. One is that it will elevate her in the Putin regime, and it is a kind of promotion. But at the same time, it's also, I think, an important signal to the Putin regime that, hey, these institutions are going to pick not just the very top people, but they're going to pick public officials sort of who are D and E and F level. So don't be comfortable. This is not going to be something that you'll be able to brush off, even though you are a sort of a middle-ranking person in the regime. So that's, I think, significant. Does this mean that the West is giving up on Putin? I think symbolically, this expresses Putin's drift and isolation from the Western world. But in practice, the answer is no. And I noticed that, about 1% of you, maybe 0.5% of you, really freaked out at one of the recent videos on here on the second channel, on the chat channel, when I said that the West is committed to a Ukrainian resistance up to the point of survival, but not to the point of complete victory. And even though I have spent months arguing that this isn't enough, actually, just that judgment of the position of the Western powers vis-a-vis this conflict freaked a small minority of you out, because you're not even prepared to hear facts that don't ally with your wishful thinking, quite frankly. And some of the questions that came up there in the comment section were questions that were almost traumatic. In other words, they were like, what's your source? How do you know? Who told you? What statements are you referring to? Well, of course, this isn't a matter of statements. This is a matter of interpretation. And when people are triggered, what happens is that they lose this epistemic dimension of interpretation from their sight, and they try to reduce everything to the normative, what should or shouldn't happen, and to facts. And if you don't give me facts, there's nothing normatively that is I'm going to move on. So let me then restate the thing again. The West is committed to Ukraine's survival, to Ukraine's independence, to Ukraine's rebuilding after the war. It is not committed to a full victory of Ukraine over the Russian invaders. And it would welcome that victory, but it's not setting Ukraine up for that victory. And I think many of the arguments I've made indicate why this may be a strategic misjudgment. And that's part of a fascinating conversation about whether Mr. Putin is a guy who can stop by himself or whether he needs to be stopped. And my argument very clearly is that he needs to be stopped. So in answer to this question, does this mean that the West has given up on Putin and that the West is no longer open to negotiating with Putin in the future? No, it doesn't mean that, even though my own recommendation is that, well, you should certainly talk to Putin. You shouldn't negotiate with him because of the way his regime is now tied to this war, which actually goes beyond Ukraine. And it seems to me that this war cannot end, although it can halt, without the end of the Putin regime. Will it be harder for Putin to appeal to the population in 2024? Well, elections are still important in Russia because of this quality they have, which academics who work on this stuff describe as acclimation. So it's not that the people are being asked really about who should be in power. Not at all. The regime decides everything, and then it creates the condition for the population to give it a thumbs up after it's all been decided. And so elections are moments of risk for a regime like that, even though they are completely, crook. I don't think, though, that this poses a problem, because this will just make the Russians who are coherently opposed to the war be in shock about just how far their regime has descended, and it'll make the Russians who are completely depoliticized just look away more, because now facing up to, the failure of their relationship with politics means facing up to the fact that their leader is now it's going to arrest warrant for him in the International Criminal Court. That's what depoliticization can lead to. And the people who are pro-Putin are going to take this as an encouragement and a mark of honor. How will it affect the elite around Putin? Consolidation, more consolidation. A lot of Western policies have led to consolidation of the elite around Putin. We're going to talk about why that it's happened like that. Some of it couldn't have been avoided, actually, but some of it perhaps could have been. But they're going to be consolidated around him, knowing this is a boat that they really can't jump off. What about the bureaucratic elite? A lot of people who do economic policy and so on. I do think symbolically this will be a shock, because these are people who have been quite a bit in denial about the extremity of the situation. And a very big part of their psychology has been, well, even if the Putin regime is so terrible, at least we'll make the consequences of its terribleness a bit less bad for the Russian people by doing the economic policy properly, at least. So symbolically, this will shake a lot of people up, I think, actually, because it's an indication of the fact that, no matter how much you try to normalize things, something, will eventually creep out of the carpet, creep out from below the carpet, and this is one such thing. Putin's reaction. Putin will be in love, because he is kind of now in a mode where it's very difficult to give him evidence of anything that doesn't consolidate his pre-existing position. It's, I think, a big feature of where he's at the moment, how much degeneration psychologically he has experienced. And I think that his logic will be something like this. Well, if you look at the ICC's intervention in Mr. Gaddafi's legacy, you could argue that, and this has been an argument made in the West, it's not really possible to settle it, that the ICC getting involved left Gaddafi with absolutely no exit strategy, and therefore created a situation where the West's intervention became more a matter of regime change than a matter of some kind of humanitarian intervention. And so therefore, that sort of, couple of rough brushstrokes that we've put on the canvas, that's exactly the kind of thing that Putin will think about. In other words, that this ICC business is just a kind of really ugly expression of Western hypocrisy and the West's appalling policy of regime change. So he'll see it as a kind of toothless and hypocritical expression of the West's deceitful desire to do a regime change on him that's been there for a long time, even though the West has been denying it. We're going to do a live or two, maybe even on the weekend, on the chat channel. So keep an eye out for that if you've got questions. One way of asking is to ask just a couple of minutes before the live starts, because I have this policy of coming in and seeing what's already there and starting with that. So see you very soon. Lots of love. Thanks for being with me for this announcement about Mr. Putin's new status.